Welcome back to the swamp, my friends, and welcome if you're new. Today's episode is going to be longer than usual, featuring some brand new stories and some older ones that you may or may not have heard before. That's all going to come together in this extra long episode for you so you can enjoy it no matter what you're doing. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I am always looking for brand new scary stories to share in the swamp. If you haven't already, be sure to come join me over on Twitch. I recently started streaming multiple times a week over there. I play horror games, watch very bad horror movies, and just about everything in between. It's a lot of good fun, and I love to get to know you guys more. You can find a link in the description. Now, get ready. Sit back, relax, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and get ready for some creepy as hell, disturbing horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. This story comes from my uncle and my grandfather originally. It has been retold to us so many times as kids growing up that I can repeat it verbatim. So please, understand that they are not the type of people to lie or make up a fictional story to tell. To my knowledge, this is 100% true, and I've retold it to the best of my knowledge as accurately as possible. My grandfather was the owner and operator of a tugboat company that ran barges up and down rivers all over Louisiana, the Mississippi River included, and on occasion, they would even be as far north as the Ohio River. My uncles have told me stories of them sweating in Louisiana and then breaking ice on the Mississippi River during their work stint with their boat. Later, the company was sold to a giant corporation and my grandfather's small fleet of 3 tugboats. However, many memories and stories remain from their time operating. These stories are still being carried down from my mother and her siblings, who all worked as a part of the company at some point in their life. For context, sometime around 1975 in Louisiana, my uncle, who was about 20 at the time, and my grandfather had boarded one of their boats one day to get in some extra work. Although the company employed many other employees in addition to my family who worked it, my uncle and grandfather were the only ones on the boat that day, as this wasn't typically a scheduled workday. It was something that they could handle on their own. After the day of work, as night fell, they had a dinner prepared in the galley, to which my uncle went and ate. He then returned to the bridge where my grandfather was operating the boat. After a short time, my uncle looked over the ship's side, where he noticed a man. He saw the man with a long, scraggly white beard and long hair raking what appeared to be leftover food into the river. My uncle quickly looked over at my grandfather and said, "I thought we were the only ones on the boat tonight." My grandfather responded, "We are, son. Why?" My uncle then said, "Well, who's the man down there?" My grandfather quickly got up to go look, and the man was gone. In a rush, they checked the entire boat. Every compartment, every nook and cranny. They were indeed the only ones on that ship. They returned to the bridge, to which my grandfather asked my uncle to describe the man he saw. My uncle told him he had a long white beard, long hair, raking food into the river. My grandfather was taken aback as he quickly realized what it must have been. This was their newest boat, and he had bought it a few years before. It was for a reasonable price. However, the ship did come with a story. Several years before my grandfather purchased it, a man was killed on this boat and fixed it up. He never told anyone else this story, as he thought nothing of it and didn't want them to worry about buying a boat involved in such an accident. As my grandfather's story goes, a man was working on this particular boat on a day when it was about to collide with a barge. In their attempt to stop the 2 vessels from crashing, a man fell between them and was crushed as they hit. The reason my grandfather was taken aback? The man my uncle described fit the exact description of the man that was destroyed on the boat just a few years prior. Over the next 10 to 15 years, this boat was in operation for my grandfather's company. It came to be known for being haunted, as this was not the last experience anyone had on that boat, nor the last time the man with the long white beard would be seen. Hello, Swamp Dweller. This is a story that occurred to me about a week ago. I won't reveal my name for obvious reasons, but I also fear the government may get involved. This story is quite different from the occasional cryptid or creepy person attempting to abduct you. This is much different from your typical story, because this story takes place in the Gulf of Mexico. It's extraordinary and unbelievable, but it did happen, and I felt that I should share it with you all. Without any further ado, let's dive into this story, pun intended. It was a sunny afternoon out on the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and it was beautiful and peaceful. I was on a small sports fishing boat with 4 other people. They had been very successful that day catching fish, but they were releasing them due to the fishing regulations. At one point, I saw a massive king mackerel, which many people confused with barracudas because of its sheer size and appearance. The king mackerel was a whopping 3, maybe 4 feet long and weighing a hefty 160 pounds. This one was a keeper. About 30 minutes later, things started getting strange. Less and fewer fish were being caught, and if some were seen, they would act very strange. As soon as we got a fish aboard, it would start gnashing its mouth at anyone nearing it and began flopping towards the closest person as if they were trying to kill. That's when the clouds started rolling in out of nowhere. We could see bolts of lightning strike in the distance, and the waves became violent. We immediately began scrambling on the boat to get away from the incoming storm. But as we started, the storm caught up, and we were now just in hopes and prayers. An overwhelming feeling of absolute dread overcame the entirety of us. That's when I saw it. A white object is ejecting out of the rough seas like a rocket. Hey, did y'all see that? I had to shout because of the storm. The others turned in the direction that I was talking about. The thing shot out of the water and over the boat. It was huge, more significant than our fishing boat. It was ghost white and strangely beautiful to witness. It had the body of a shark, the head of a viper fish, and the tail of an eel. It had fins like that of a goldfish. It dropped gracefully into the waves next to our boat, sending a massive swell of seawater upwards like a depth charge. As we were going as fast as the ship could go, the creature was trailing behind. Like a snake, it slithered through the water. It then went down. Not just 10 seconds later, it exploded out of the water like a missile and crashed into the waves. This went on for maybe 10 or 15 minutes until, as if losing interest in us, it turned back out to the sea. Bizarrely, the storm shortly let up as we got farther away from the beast. Eventually, we reached the coast and discovered, to our horror, the king mackerel was now out of the tank of water we kept for live fish. We reeled back as the fish was violently hissing at us, snapping at us with its jaws. It was slowly using its fins to pull itself to us. This thing's eyes were rolled back as if it were possessed. "Oh, F this," one of the guys said, as we'll call him Jack, grabbed the cleaver to mercilessly kill the fish that we caught to sell to the market, and brought down the cleaver upon the mackerel's head. The head was cleaved off, the body went still, but the head was still moving. The body still moves when you cut off a chicken's head, except the roles are reversed now. This was not very good to see, as none of us had ever seen anything like this before. The white eyes of the fish now started bleeding tears, and then it freaking screamed. It sounded like an attempt at a human scream, and it didn't sound enjoyable at all. It just continued screaming as blood kept trickling out of its eyes. Then the screams turned into gurgles as it was somehow spewing blood from its mouth. About 1 minute passed until the scream stopped, and the head went slack. The eyes rolled back to normal before they died. I have zero answers as to what the hell happened. Maybe it had something to do with the albino creature out in the Gulf. Perhaps it was something paranormal. Perhaps they're completely unrelated. But something is going on in the Gulf of Mexico. This particular story is possibly the most traumatic week of my life. Sounds dramatic, I know. I'm already questioning whether or not I even want to put this out there. My name is Kira. I had a lot of issues with my parents growing up, but they always seemed to trump my feelings of uncertainty with annual trips to the Caribbean. Being from Canada, I always enjoyed the palm trees and vibrant aquamarine of the sea, but mostly I enjoyed the week-long break from the bullies at my elementary school. I felt lucky. I knew I had an opportunity many kids in my class did not. More than anything, though, I was just happy to have something good in my life. My parents were the type to take me on vacation, give me beers at the age of 10, and tell me about all the crazy stuff they did growing up. However, I was not allowed to have male friends, I was physically abused for the minor mistakes that I made, and my emotional needs were ignored. It's not relevant to the story, so I won't go into much more detail. But I was left with the impression that I constantly needed to impress and suck up to my parents if I wanted their love and attention, especially my dad. I tried so hard for him. I try to impress him to this day, but I can't help it. My parents took me to the Dominican Republic during March break for this particular vacation. I was 7 years old and this was my first trip overseas. We stayed at a resort on the waterfront of a popular tourist spot. We spent most of our days there on the beach. I was a fantastic swimmer and loved the water at the time. You had to drag me out of it practically. Nothing could break my spirit, nothing could scare me, I thought. I always considered my parents to be somewhat responsible. They were so strict I just thought it was because they were trying to protect me and do what was best. Looking back though, I get angry at how wrong I was. On the second day of our trip, my father walked me down to the beach. From what I can remember, we ended up at a boat rental area. They had kayaks and other small boats, what they called kayaks I guess, but these weren't kayaks. They were more like paddle boards. They were primarily flat and you sat on them rather than in them. My dad essentially told me to get the kayak and be safe, and don't mess around with the paddleboard. While dragging me out in one of these kayaks and pushing me into the water, a young girl around my age approached me, asking if she could join. I was practically conditioned into subservience, so I allowed it. We rode around in the shallow waters until she noticed some big waves out on the horizon. She insisted we go out there. I was scared, and I knew it was dangerous and a bad idea. But I've never had anybody convince me of doing something I didn't want to do, really. So, against my better judgment, we rode out there, and slowly but surely we approached waves taller than the two of us combined. We immediately realized our predicament and attempted to turn around, but it was far too late. A 10-foot wave flipped our tiny boat and flung us into the sea. The waves crashed over me repeatedly. All I could do was see the bottom of the ocean for a while. I remember thinking it was beautiful. I couldn't stay though. I had to do something. The waves were still coming at me with my head finally above the water. I couldn't see anything over them, and I felt myself dragged beneath. Finally, I saw the girl. I hated her, and I didn't want to help her. Then I saw the boat. Both were maybe 20 feet away in opposite directions. I swam harder than ever towards the ship. Tears were streaming down my face. I eventually got us back onto the kayak, and our oars were nowhere in sight. We used our arms to paddle us forward, and after some time, what felt like an hour, maybe even more, we were back in the calmer waters, where we found one of our missing oars. We used it to get back to shore as quickly as possible. Upon arriving on the beach, we both ran back to our parents. At least I assume that's where she went, as we never saw each other again. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. Even after relaying that and all of what happened to my parents, they didn't seem to even get the hint that I should be supervised. I wasn't a bad kid, but as a 7-year-old in a foreign country, you'd think they'd be more cautious. A couple of days later, I walked down to the beach by myself, where an older gentleman approached me. He had a strange accent and asked me how old I was. I told him, though I was genuinely creeped out by him. I felt like I had to answer his questions. He was an adult and was therefore in charge. He then asked me if I would hang out with his son, Frederick. I still was nervous, but I reluctantly said yes. I was scared of this man, but at the same time I wanted another kid to play with as I was lonely. He took me to him, who to his credit was real. I hadn't been tricked or lured, and all my worries instantly melted away. Frederick and his father were visiting from Poland, and Frederick and I bonded, talking about our home countries, interests, and absent parents. I then learned that Frederick was 13. This concerned me though, not as much as it should have probably. Being only 7 years old, I knew that he was what was considered at my school a big kid. When you're a kid, a 6-year difference really is a lot. It feels like they have as much control over you as an adult, but we got along great, so I had no reason to think of him as anything other than a friend. We continued to hang out for several days. We would meet up at a specific spot on the beach, and we would talk and play in the sand. We never really went in the water. We would chat and explore the coast. It was a lot of fun. I liked Frederick. On the 3rd day we met up, we played around in the sand. By this point I noticed his father was never around. I had only ever seen him the first day when he approached me alone. I didn't think much of it. Frederick suggested we go into the water. As someone who loved the ocean, I was more than happy to oblige. I was honestly waiting for this. I loved the sand, but I wanted to swim. We went in the water talking and laughing, except he kept moving further and further out to sea until I eventually couldn't touch the bottom. He was more than a foot taller than I was, so I assumed he didn't realize I couldn't feel him anymore. But then, his whole demeanor changed. We were facing each other. I was facing the shore, and he was facing the open ocean. He was blocking my path back to the beach, though this wasn't a concern at the time until he started acting weird. Nothing leading up to this point would have led me to believe he was a threat. He asked me about my body and if I had ever seen a guy's private parts. Thinking this was a joke, I said no. He then asked me if my parents knew where I was. I once again stupidly said no. I was getting worried out, and I told him I wanted to go back to the beach. He ignored me, and then he asked, "Do you want to see it?" Surprisingly, at this point, I actually kinda knew what was going on, and I wasn't being an idiot for once. I tried to swim past him, but he grabbed my arm before I could say anything. He put both hands on top of my head and shoved me underwater. I was kicking and screaming, knowing no one could hear me or save me. I felt so helpless. I felt like I was leaving my body. I could see his legs, I could see the empty blue, I could see my parents lying on lounge chairs half a mile up the beach, sun-tanning, drinking cocktails, not a worry in the world. Anger consumed me. I was a good swimmer. I was in martial arts. I knew I could do better. I deserved a chance at life. I wanted my freedom so severely I kicked and kicked and kicked, and I kicked Frederick right in the jewels by pure chance. I somehow made it back to shore by grasping for air and swimming like I was in the Olympics. I ran to my parents, and though they questioned why I was out of breath, all I could say was, I never want to see Frederick again. And I didn't. During the last couple of days of the trip, my parents looked out for me. They never even questioned my decision to stop seeing this kid who they'd never even met. I put it out of my mind, too. I'm 24 years old now. I recently brought it up to my mother, telling her the whole story. She cried. I get it. I love my parents. Unfortunately, they didn't start paying attention to me until I no longer needed it. When I was a young teenager, my friend Nathan and I would often take my family's large sea kayak out to cross the nearby river to a small creek around a half a kilometer away and shoot off adjacent to an abandoned golf course. This creek was very slow moving compared to the large Hawkesbury River, and as a result, a lot of rubbish and debris would collect at the mouth of the river before slowly being distributed throughout its length. Nathan and I spent a lot of time at this creek. We even built a small jetty to tie the kayak to using long sticks and baling twine from hay bales that we used to feed the horses with back at home. We used this jetty to moor the kayak while we navigated the mess of prickly pear cacti that guarded the borders of the golf course. The golf course itself was incredibly eerie. No animals, birds, or even insects could be heard or seen on it. Every noise you made echoed back at you from a nearby sandstone cliff face. The closest thing we saw to an animal was the skeleton of a kangaroo that we found around the second time we went there. It was strange, as we had only been to the spot around a week prior and there was no corpse. Yet there in the middle of the clearing, it was a complete kangaroo skeleton. sun-bleached and scattered about. We picked up some of the bones and admired them closely, remarking on what part of the skeleton we thought each bone was before tossing them aside. I took the skull back with me in the kayak and placed it on the bookshelf in my room when I got home that afternoon. I often took things back from my outings. Nathan never seemingly did though, but he was always on the lookout for something for me to collect. The next time we went out to the creek, we decided to try our luck at exploring the waterway as far down as possible. We armed ourselves with machetes and small hatchets that we had used when we built the jetty and set off. The journey was made extremely difficult by vines that spanned the creek from bank to bank. Sunken logs and dense river weeds produced paddling nearly impossible. The water was full of garbage too. Broken tubes, life jackets, boat propellers, you name it, it made its way there. As we made it through to a relatively rubbish-free area with dark, ominous-looking water, I looked down briefly and saw what I thought was a doll's head just below the water's surface. I stopped paddling to crane my neck over to see it more clearly. It was a doll's head, around a foot below the surface, as if it was tethered there from the riverbed. It was looking up with a blank expression and light blue eyes. I instantly got a panicked feeling as I gazed at it. Before I could say anything, Nathan exclaimed, "Ah, cool," and plunged his hand into the water. He was surprised how deep he had to reach to wrap his fingers around the head, but Nathan was a determined dude. He lifted the head out of the water and grinned at me. Streams of water ran from his closed fist as he triumphantly held it out toward me. I took it reluctantly from him. It was a tiny doll's head, around 3 inches in diameter. The charge was sun-damaged, and as a result, it had lost a lot of the paint features. There were no discernible pupils on its eyes, just the blue-colored iris. This gave the thing an alarming look. I shook my head and placed the head on the front of the kayak to look like a figurehead of the old wooden ship. Nathan laughed. "Let's call him Bob," he said while grinning. I gave him a deadpan look. I was trying not to laugh. "You're so original," I scoffed at him before returning to resume paddling. I stopped immediately when I saw Bob staring straight back at me. I had not placed him like that. I had set him facing forward. I knew I had because his face creeped me out, and I did not want to look at it. Nathan paddled while I rested, so we moved at a good pace. As I was at the front of the boat, I was meant to watch for obstacles and call out if I saw something ahead. However, I was entirely focused on Bob as we struck a submerged tree and came to an abrupt stop. Everything on the kayak jumped forward due to this. Nathan and me, our packed lunches, and water bottles. Nothing too major happened. Everything on the kayak had jumped forward, except for the doll's head. I had kept my eye on it the entire time, and it did not even move half an inch. It was like this thing was super glued to the boat. Nathan began teasing me about being blind. I snapped at him to be quiet. He asked what was wrong, and I leaned to the right for him to see the head. I pointed and said, "It didn't move, dude." While half chuckling, Nathan moved forward to look at it closer. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. I picked up my paddle and took a slow stroke backward in the water and hit the tree again, lightly. Once again, everything in the kayak jumped forward slightly as we struck the tree except for Bob. He stayed perfectly still. Nathan laughed. "That's weird," he said, his voice trailing off. I reached out and turned Bob around on his spot, and he turned quickly. "Let's go home," I roared. He was trying to wash the area of the heavy feeling that was seeming to settle down upon us. Nathan agreed, and we turned the kayak around to head home. I watched the head like a hawk. Bob never looked back at me on the whole trip home. When we got home, we packed everything up that we could into our backpacks and lifted the kayak out of the water. The head was stuffed into my pocket. I had not told Nathan about how creeped out I was of this thing, for fear that he would give me crap about it, or maybe give him possible ammunition to play a dumb prank on me with it. Nathan was and still is my best friend, and he would have done that if I told him, just as I would have done it to him if the roles had been reversed. I decided to keep my mouth shut about the doll head and hoped Nathan would simply forget about it. We trudged over to my neighbor's backyard with the kayak, holding it by the handles at both ends. My pocket started to feel very warm. I stopped listening to Nathan's nonsense and focused more and more on the head's ever-increasing temperature inside my bag. Each time I thought, it can't get any hotter. It somehow would. It was not a burning sensation, more like the feeling of deep heat as it gets left on. I tried my best to ignore it. It was getting dark now, and I wanted to call home. We dropped our kayak off in the garage, put away the machetes and hatchet before making our way upstairs for dinner. I took a detour to my room to dump the head out of my pocket and onto my bed. I left it there while I left to join my friend Nathan and my family for dinner. When Nathan and I finished dinner and entered my bedroom to sleep later that night, the head was absent from the bottom bunk. My room was a mess admittedly, but it still should have been in that cleared spot that I put it in. I took a little time to look for it. I tossed the blankets and sheets and climbed over to peer down through the gap between the bed and wall. I could not see it anywhere. I was concerned, but not too concerned. I was somewhat relieved that it was gone. However, I had a gnawing feeling that it was still around somewhere. He was not exactly watching me, but I knew there was a presence around. Nathan seemed to have forgotten about it though. He never brought Bob back up again that night, and he climbed up to the top bunk and promptly fell asleep. I lay down on my bunk on the bottom and pulled the bundle of blankets haphazardly over me. I was falling asleep quickly as well. The next day I was awoken by thumping noises coming from nearby. I got up out of bed to glance out the window into the paddock of our front property to see my stepfather using the hatchet to hack at a tree stump that was much too large for the little axe. My stepfather was a brilliant man, but his grasp of common sense sometimes bordered on the absurd. I yawned, rubbing my eyes and turning around before opening them. I froze in place. On the shelf in front of the kangaroo skull was Bob. His eyes looked at me once again, directly into mine. I turned to look at Nathan, still sleeping on the top bunk, and instantly jumped on the railing to punch him hard in the upper arm. He awoke with a pained cry and looked at me with a scowl. "What the hell, man?" he demanded, lifting his other arm to place his palm over the spot that I had struck with the punch. "Like you don't know, you mofo," I said with a half-assed laugh. I was trying to mask the trembling tone in my voice. Nathan looked incredulously back at me. I stared at him to see if his stoic expression would falter. It always would when he played pranks. It did not, though. I shook my head and strafed across the room, going to the bookshelf so he could see it. I pointed at the top shelf. "You didn't put it there?" I asked quietly. Nathan sat there to get a better look and shook his head. "Nah, man, I would have had him facing outward anyway. You know I would have." I spun my head around so fast that my neck nearly broke. Sure enough, the face was now facing toward the kangaroo skull and not outward like it was before. I started shaking, unable to hold myself up without the railing any longer. I dropped to the floor and stormed over to my bookshelf to pick up Bob and took him into the kitchen. I threw him into the bin and took out the trash and took it out to the fire pit. Ever since then, I've not taken anything from that river. I don't really know what's going on. I don't know if it was a haunted doll or if the river itself has something going on with it. It does feel weird. Like I said, you never hear any animal sounds. It's full of trash and it just seems like wasteland. I'd love to know your opinions in the chat down below. What do you think I experienced? Let me ask you something. Do you feel like a failure? Do you feel like you're nothing but a walking sack of flaws held by a sack of meat? Do you wish you could change it? If so, how would you do it? Would you try changing your dietary habits, eat less junk food, eat more veggies, etc.? Maybe try exercising more or hitting the gym 3 times a week, right? Perhaps you'll finally ask out that super hot coworker that has you tongue-tied every time you try to talk to her. Oh, I know. You'll try turning to faith to seek out some higher form of encouragement, won't you? Let me guess though, you've tried most, if not all, of the aforementioned methods, haven't you? You've done what the hippies and the shrinks have shouted at you, and you still feel like your place is nowhere in this godforsaken world, right? I'll bet you'd sell your soul just to feel like you mean something in this life, wouldn't you? I bet you wish that you could be perfect. But what if you could be? Now, before you accuse me of blowing smoke, hear me out. Yes, there is a way for you and me, human beings, to be perfect. Just imagine it for a second. You could live for the rest of your life without flaws. No, you'd live unable to create flaws. You'd never make any mistakes. You'd never hurt anybody. You'd always be able to finish what you start. And best of all, you'll never fail at anything again. Sounds great, right? I'll bet it sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? I can practically hear your next words coming a mile away. How in the hell am I supposed to make myself perfect? Well, if you really are that desperate to know, I can tell you how. Don't ask me right now how I know about what I'm about to tell you. I'll get to that later. In all honesty, it's all something I am truly still trying to comprehend. For now, if you're still serious about this, here's how to begin. A quick history lesson on this is that the game or ritual itself is called the Ritual of the Damned Lamb. It was apparently used by various, lesser-known, unnamed, and underground religious societies and/or cults in older times, usually as a way of ascension, or for seeking some divine forgiveness for trespassing in some of the old faith. Only very, very, very few individuals today from these faiths are even still around, and even then they might not even still use this practice today. I say all of this because there's essentially a prerequisite for attempting this. You have to believe in something. It doesn't have to be Christianity, obviously, given that the religions that practice this weren't exactly what most would consider to be Christians themselves. You could be Christian, Catholic, Buddhist, Muslim, Wiccan, or even some made-up religious belief like Heaven's Gate or whatever. Just as long as you believe in the existence of some higher power, you're set to begin this practice. Here's what you'll need: sticks or twigs, an empty room or at least a length and width of 6 to 8 feet of open floor space, a blade or object sharp enough to draw blood, and a blindfold of some sort. To begin, take the sticks or twigs you've gathered and place them into your empty space, forming them into the shape of whatever symbol or talisman represents your personal faith or beliefs. You'll need to make the symbol large enough to lie down on top of it, so that the number of sticks will vary according to the shape and size of the symbol. Next, remove all clothing and using your sharp object, pierce the palms of your hands and smear your blood at the points where your hands, head, and feet would be. Lie down inside the shape of your symbol and put on your blindfold. Make sure your blindfold is on tight, painfully tight if need be. You should be able to see nothing but complete darkness throughout this for it to work. Lastly, take your sharp object and carve an X into the center of your chest and whisper, "In the names of those that stand beyond our veil, I offer unto thee my blood, my flesh, and my mind for sale. Take it, for I am thy damned lamb, and grant me perfection that I may never fail again." Now, lay calmly and still inside your symbol. Eventually, you'll start to feel a stinging sensation, like you're being poked with a bunch of hot needles or shards of glass in your chest. Keep calm and lie still. Trust me, movement will only make it hurt worse. You should start hearing multiple faint whispers circling simultaneously around in your mind. They'll each be in different languages and different tones. Some will just whisper like it's trying to tell you a secret, while others will scream to you like they're in pain. Again, stay calm and try to listen to each word being said. You should start to hear words form together to create a jumbled, distorted mess of words. Yet, you'll somehow be able to comprehend it in your own language. What exactly is said may vary. but essentially it should be something to the effect of, "I have come, my child. What doth thou seek?" To this, you must enter one word: perfection. Now, you should start to feel the stabbing sensation in your hands and feet as well. Again, stay calm and still. The voice will ask your name, your age, your sex, date of birth, and finally, what you believe in. Answer the questions clearly and honestly. It will know if you're lying, and it will make this whole thing that much more painful for you. Now, here's where your endurance is tested. The voice will then proceed to describe moments of your life where you exhibited some imperfection or flaw. It will be described in great detail to you, essentially forcing you to relive the moment yourself. At first, it'll be something small and minute, something you'd normally pass off, like the white little lies you would tell your mom and dad to try to get out of trouble, or maybe even the time you got away with sneaking off with that dollar store candy bar. Over time, however, it will start to be more detailed, and more personal flaws or embarrassments in your life will come to light. The ones you've tried to keep secret, as well as even the ones you've managed to repress. It will then ask you to either confess or deny what was said. Whatever it is, like before, answer truthfully. For each confession, the pain in your hands, feet, and chest will gradually become worse and almost unbearable. Remain calm and still and continue to answer honestly. Eventually, the described moments will have caught up to the present, and it will then ask you if you wish to be made perfect. Should you answer no, I couldn't even say what would happen. Now, here's where I answer your question from before, about how I know all of this. It was about a year ago today, now that I performed this ritual. I was looking at my final days on death row, the needle waiting for me. I won't go into detail on what I had done, or should I say, what I didn't do to land me here. Suffice to say, I was a very bad man who destroyed the lives of good people in many ways, and I'll be the first to tell you that I deserved every bit of what was waiting for me. That was the day I was to be visited by a priest for my last confessions. By that point, I'd already been long past the state of mind or heart to care about clearing my conscience. I'd already confessed to everything in the courtroom. What was it gonna do to repeat myself to a random, pious moron anyway? The way I saw it, my place in hell was booked and reserved, and nothing was gonna change that. I remember when he first walked up to my cell. He was a middle-aged man wearing a black trench coat and a hat like he was the exorcist or something, and his face was pale and gaunt. To tell the truth, I almost thought I'd finally lost my mind and I was now seeing ghosts or something when I first saw him. For a while, he just stared at me with the coldest, deadest eyes I'd ever seen outside of a Vietnam vet. "Well," I said annoyed, "either sprout your scriptures or shove off. I've already confessed everything and I'm screwed no matter what I say or do now. So unless you're the miracle you're about to run your mouth about is that you're holding a pardon from the governor, please spare me." He just continued staring daggers at me, and I was tempted to do something to cause a disruption to make him leave. "I'm here," he said in a cracked yet baritone voice, "to offer you salvation, Mr. Keller." I looked at him again, like he was insane, before chuckling dryly. Despite this, he just kept staring at me. "Are you serious?" I asked in disbelief. "Salvation? What do you think you're gonna get me to give my heart to Jesus or some shit like that? Look, I stopped buying into all that crap long ago. Trust me, there's no saving my soul." He stood motionless and silent. I could see from the look on his face, in his mind at least, he wasn't kidding about whatever he was talking about. That said, what the hell was that supposed to mean? Offering me salvation. He took a deep breath and spoke again. "Perhaps I should rephrase. I'm here, Mr. Keller, to offer you the opportunity for perfection." Now, I really was confused. Huh? What are you talking about? A chance at perfection? What's that even supposed to mean? He was silent again. "Well?" I urged, quickly feeling my patience leave me. "Exactly what I said, Mr. Keller. I'm here to offer you a chance to become perfect. No more pain, no flaws, none of the wickedness in your heart. You would never do anything wrong again." I was lost for words. Normally by this point, I'd have either stopped listening and ignored them until they went away, or I would have told them exactly where they could cram it and made them leave. This time though, something was different. For one thing, he said all of this with the direst conviction. In most cases, I can tell when they're just trying to spout their usual jabber at me about some sort of gospel. This wasn't that though. After all, he clarified that he was offering me perfection instead of the Lord's mercy, or anything like that. Despite this, that still didn't completely convince me that this was legit. What does he mean by becoming perfect? What are you... Allow me to enter, and I can show you what I'm talking about. Now I was convinced this guy popped a few screws loose. Right, let you in my cell, like they'd even allow that. You're funny, pal. He sighed and looked down before saying he'd be back again tomorrow. Use the time you have left wisely, Mr. Keller, was the last thing he said to me before turning and leaving to the block. Sauntering down the hallway like some supervillain in a movie. I couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning, wondering who in the name of God this crackpot was and what he was going on about. Sure enough, at 10 a.m. the next morning, there he was approaching my cell in that same menacing fashion he did the previous day with a duffel bag. I was caught off guard. However, when I saw two of the guards then unlock and open the cell door letting him in, before I could ask if the guards themselves had lost their damn minds, he held up his hand, silencing me, and said, "Just listen to me." Without any real way to argue or protest, I scoffed and gestured him to go on. He then went on to tell me about the ritual of the damned lamb, how to perform it, and the different groups that performed it for divination and all that, as I said earlier. While he railed on, he started pulling out the aforementioned materials out of his bag, the sticks, the blade, the blindfold. I was instantly in shock seeing the knife. How in the hell did he manage to get that past the front? I wondered. Probably the same way he managed to convince them to even let him into my cell. In any case, he then asked me if I was ready to perform the ritual to become perfect, to quote his words. Now, I was the silent one. Has anyone ever accomplished this? I can't say for certain. Only they would know. And where exactly are they now? I was not feeling good about any of this. He looked away from the supplies, fixing me in that cold, demented glare again. Again, Mr. Keller, I cannot say for certain. Those that embark on this trial do so alone. If it will answer your question, I will say that those I knew to have performed the ritual, I've not seen since. That was it. I couldn't take this ominously vague crap anymore, and I felt like this ritual, or whatever it was not a good idea. Okay, look, I'm not interested in whatever the hell this is, and my patience is just about gone, so I ask you one more time to piss off and leave me alone. Like the last time, he just lowered his head and silently got up and left. I was then alone again in my cell, 2 days away from execution. Funny enough, it actually took me a minute to realize that the man had left his stuff behind in my cell. Looking back, I'm certain he did this on purpose. I spent hours just looking at the materials, thinking about everything the man had said about this ritual. He had to have been nuts, I thought. How would I become perfect? I still wasn't sure what he even meant. Perfect? Perfect how? And how exactly would this make me become perfect? Not to mention the idea that none who have attempted this have ever been seen again. Another part of me, however, could not help but look back at the stuff he looked behind, wondering the perfection and what it would look like. No more pain, no flaws, none of the wickedness in your heart? I can't lie here. I know I said that I was beyond hoping for anything other than to burn for the things that I had done, which was true. That being said, that doesn't preclude me from the weight of my conscience. That's right, even a fiend like me has a bit of a heart. After all, imagine that. I mean, yeah, it all still sounded like a load of crap, and didn't sound like it would turn out good for anyone who did it. As far as I know, it wasn't even possible to actually complete this ritual, and even if I did, what would even happen? Then again, what would I really be losing here if I did? It was in this mind that I began setting up everything for the ritual. Though I wasn't any devout Christian or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination, I did believe that there was some sort of God out there. A God that would damn me as soon as he saw me. Anyway, I had set up the sticks in the form of a cross and tied the blindfold around my head, carving the X in my chest and reciting the incantation. In the names of those that stand beyond our veil, I offer unto thee my blood, my flesh, and my mind for sale. Take it, for I am the damned lamb, and grant me perfection, that I may never again fail. For about 5 minutes, nothing was happening. I started wondering what might happen when one of the guards walks by to see all of this. Then again, how had they not already? I guessed that the old goat went and managed to pay them off for that too. Soon though, I did start to hear the whispers I mentioned before. Something else I should mention about this is how real they will sound. What I mean by this is that they won't sound like some ghostly wail, like what you're probably thinking. No, these will sound like the voices of normal people, clear and defined, and they sound like they're nearby, sometimes right even by your ear. It was all so soft at first, and I thought it must have been a couple of the guards whispering outside my cell. Then, though, they got louder and louder, and I noticed how they were all different in languages. One was in Spanish, another I think was in German, and so on and so forth. A couple of them I'm not even sure it was an actual known language, more like some archaic tongues or something like that. Finally, they mixed together to form the words in English. I have come, my child. What doth thou seek? The voice was commanding and hypnotic in a way, despite it also sounding half dead. My tongue was frozen for a moment before remembering what I had to say, stammering out, perfection. Immediately, I cried out and seized in pain when I felt the stabbing in my hands and feet. The movements caused the pain to amplify. Once I was able to force myself to lie still, I heard the voice ask my name, age, birthday, sex, and my belief. I struggled to answer, feeling the constant pain and fighting the urges to seize up again. My name is Jeremiah Keller. I'm 35, born April 6th, 1984, male. The pain increased dramatically, feeling now like my hands and feet had been set on fire, and I heard the voice thunder in my head, asking me again what I believed in. After a moment's consideration and increasing pain, I finally blurted out, Christian Baptist. Slowly the burning subsided, and it went back to feeling like my hands and feet were being stabbed. The voice then began to describe the time when I was 5 and I used to terrorize my neighbor's cat by nailing it with my Red Ryder. It also described how I would lie when questioned about it to get off scot-free. Finally, it asked me whether I admit my guilt or deny. I remember that the man told me about being honest and confessing to my imperfections. When he told me about this, and I had a feeling that lying would make the extra pain from before return. Yes, I confess. I let out a sharp yelp when the pain started erupting in the center of my chest as well as the rest. At first, I thought I was suffering from a heart attack, which made me seize again, in turn causing the pain to increase. Next, the voice started telling me about the time when I was 8, and I used the pocket knife I got for my birthday to shave my little sister's head in her sleep. This caused her to have to be rushed to the ER after I dug too deep and embedded part of it into her head. She survived, but now lives with major mental disabilities, chronic narcolepsy, severe amnesia, and even has trouble trying to speak because of it. When it asked me to confess or deny this time, I was a lot more hesitant to answer. That was one of the many horrible things I had done that I honestly had damn near forgotten completely about until that moment. Reliving it again, I was tempted to deny, anything to get rid of the guilt again. I deny. A big mistake. Before I could even finish saying that, I felt the burning in my chest and limbs again, much more worse this time. Of course, the extreme pain would cause me to seize again, and yes, this again made it worse. Alright, I confess, I did it. I fucking did it, God, I'm sorry. Like before, my confession caused the burning to go away immediately. It was after another minute or two before I could relax my body again, and the voice began another scene from my life. I don't know exactly how long it went on like this, the voice forcing me to confess to wrongs or imperfections of my life, while I struggled, both from physical and emotional pain, to answer the way I was supposed to. I know that, like I've said, it gradually started describing to me more and more horrific things I had done over the years up to the present. the animals I used to torture just because, the children I used to kidnap and hold for ransom, some of which wouldn't live after I was through with them because mommy and daddy wouldn't pony up, the women I would brutally torture until they were barely even alive. All of it replayed by the voice in the gruesome detail. And of course, each confession caused the stabbing sensations to hurt worse and worse. Part of me wondered if this was what they meant in churches when they talk about divine judgment. In any case, I was indeed being judged here. What would result from it at this point was anybody's guess. Finally, I had to confess to my last imperfection, the murder of a man and his pregnant wife, the one that finally landed me here. My body was in so much pain by now, and I found myself wishing I had just chosen the needle. It then asked me if I wished to become perfect. I was almost too scared to answer. What would happen to me if I said no? Would the burning pains come back? Maybe it would be something that felt even worse. Then again, maybe nothing would happen. Maybe it'll just let me go, and I'd just go back to where I was before. I figured though I'd managed to make it here. What's the point of backing out now anyway? Whatever happens, one way or another, I'm a goner. With this, I answered yes. What actually happened next is still difficult to describe in a way that makes sense to you while being accurate. All at once I felt a giant gust of frigid air blast the front of my face, and then I felt nothing. Now when I say I felt nothing, that's exactly what I mean. Absolutely nothing. Physically, mentally, or even emotionally. Nothing. It was as if someone had hollowed me out like a watermelon, leaving me just an empty shell. Because of this, I thought I was dead at first. I realized otherwise, however, when I could hear the sounds all around me. They were voices. Not like the ones I had heard before, but actual people. I could hear all of them around me, chatting, laughing, and even whispering. It was all just mundane stuff like who's seeing who, who's running late, husbands telling their families I love you before heading out, stuff like that. But I heard it and understood it all. And that wasn't all. I could hear the sounds of every single insect or animal scurrying and tittering by. All of it in painfully crystal clarity. Slowly, I removed the blindfold from my eyes to see that I wasn't in my cell anymore. I was now in a large field of bright green grass. Looking around, I found that all I could see was beautiful grass, clear and defined, in excruciating detail. I could see everything super well. I saw clouds gathered overhead, and they were defined too, as were the tiny crystalline clear droplets of water that fell from them. I know you're thinking that I'm just on drugs or something, describing my latest trip, but no, this was not that. Trust me, I would know the difference between a trip and reality. This was real. I wasn't sure how, but it was all real. I could now hear everything, see everything, understand everything, and yet feel nothing at all. Just empty. I looked at my hands and body to see my skin was now pure ivory. I was naked and muscular, feeling like a Greek god. I looked down to see a flower at my feet. It was lilting. Stooping down, I touched it and it immediately began to bloom in the most beautiful, radiant flower I had ever seen. I had the power to give life, I had the power to create, and yet still I felt nothing. Empty. I walked around the grassy plains and saw the grass and the flowers grow vibrant with the life under my feet. Eventually, I found a deer who had been wounded, presumably by hunters. Like with the flower, one light tap of my finger and its vitality was restored, darting off into the woods with more energy than ever. I could heal the sick, even raise the dead, yet I could feel absolutely nothing. Empty. I could now do nothing but good for the world. I was now essentially a god. No, not a god. I was God. I could create, never destroy. I could heal, never harm. I could bring happiness, never despair. I could do all of this. Yet I could feel nothing. I was empty. No, not empty. Perfect. That's when I realized exactly what I had lost when I completed the ritual. I was now God on earth, but bound as a slave to perfection. I couldn't feel anymore all the joy and happiness I now bring to others, and yet none of my own, and never will again. I could admire the things I could do now. I couldn't be proud of my new ways because I couldn't feel pride. I couldn't cry for joy when I would see the hurt be healed by me because I couldn't feel joy or tears. I couldn't be angry or hurt when I saw something or someone suffering because I couldn't feel anger or pain anymore. Happiness, sadness, joy, sorrow, pride, humility, everything, all gone. I would never feel anything again. Empty. Perfect. As I said before, I've lived like this for 2 years now, devoid of any soul or humanity. I was an evil man set to die in 2 days, and now I'm something else entirely, something more, and at the same time less. And I will continue to live like this, a slave to perfection itself, until the end of time. For I cannot die, only live. Now that I've told you all of this, let me ask you one thing. Would you wish to be perfect? Hello, Swamp Dweller. I have been listening to your stories lately, and it's brought back some memories from about 5 or 6 years ago. For some context, I live in a very large and urban Texas city. My neighborhood, however, had a big problem with coyotes. Every night at around 4 a.m., my uncle would get home from work and come across this one large coyote lurking in our front yard. Now, my whole family dismissed this as just a coyote enjoying our garden, but I believe that it could have been something else, and here's why. It began in the summer after I finished 6th grade. As a teenager, I had nothing to do, so I would stay up very late texting friends or playing something. One night I was doing so when I heard tapping on my window. It was around 1 a.m., and since my window is on the side of the house, there was no way it could have been my uncle. Plus, it was way too early for him to be coming back home. I looked out the window after it happened, but there was nothing there. On the next night, at around the same time, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was followed by whistling. It was like they were trying to whistle that Twinkle Twinkle Little Star song, but it was all wrong. It was out of rhythm. Their voice kept breaking. I was frozen because I had never experienced anything like this at this hour. That morning during my breakfast, my uncle told us he saw a coyote lurking around the yard and to be careful whenever we go out. I thought the whistling would come back the next day, but to my astonishment, it did not. I did not tell my family about it because, let's face it, who would believe me if I said somebody was whistling Twinkle Little Star outside of my window? I didn't hear it again until the next summer. At around the same time, an entire year later, the whistling returned. When I first heard it, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but it was very clear. Now at this point, my uncle did not work overnight anymore, so he didn't see the coyotes, but my neighbors did. And the morning they told us that they saw a coyote in our front yard at night, the following night, the whistling began. I know I should have recorded it, but I always froze whenever I heard it. Skip forward another year. It was now summer, a summer of staying up late that I would hear whistling outside my window once again. So, to battle this, I would try to fall asleep listening to music. One night as I was drifting off, I heard a horrendous scream. Now, I would listen to metal music, but this scream was not in the song. I paused it, and it kept going. It was the loudest, ugliest, most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. It sounded incredibly high-pitched, like an infant, but somehow with developed vocal cords. I didn't sleep much that night, afraid I'd be woken up by the screaming. That morning, I asked around the house if they heard anything, but no one apparently did. I was entirely shocked because it was incredibly loud. Loud enough to go through my closed window. Since it would always happen 2 nights in a row, I thought it would happen again the next night, but thankfully it didn't. I never heard anything like it again, actually. Fast forward to this year, and I'm regularly listening to Skinwalker stories to help me pass the time at work, and it got me digging into their history. Now, I personally didn't see anything other than coyotes, but the way whistling and shape-shifting seem to be common signs of skinwalkers has me thinking, could this have been something malevolent or just a creep tormenting me at night? No one has seen any coyotes ever since that night that I heard the screaming though, which is something else that I've also found very peculiar. Hello, Swamp Dweller. My name is Peter. I am 27 years old and I have been listening to your channel for quite some time now. I was listening to your stuff on Spotify and was reminded of an experience I had at the age of 19 years old. It was Halloween of 2013. The poetry of it. Anyway, I lived in southeast Montana, and it was my freshman year of college, and we were out due to a pipe burst. Like I said, the poetry of it all. I received a message in my friend's group chat. It was a good friend of mine, who for discretional purposes I will call L. Myself, A, D, M, and G, who was my girlfriend at the time, were invited to go drive around in his new truck. We met in the junior parking lot of the high school that bordered our neighborhood. We gave a homeless guy enough money to buy an ungodly amount of beer. We talked about numerous things, and among them was the subject of tonight's gathering. We came to the conclusion that being that it was Halloween, in the spirit of the occasion, we had to do something spooky, which in all honesty would probably end up having us break into a poorly maintained, abandoned building or getting drunk off our asses in a graveyard. There were more than a few suggestions about what we would do, but my less reckless idea was initially driving the abandoned Highway 87 off of Elkshire Drive. After about an hour of preparing for a 3-hour ride, we set off around 5:30. We gossiped about neighborhood drama and exchanged relevant family situations and talked about crushes, grades, rumors, and what have you. At one point, I believe we even played Truth or Dare, but that's irrelevant. The first thing that struck me as odd was that the road that led to our destination was dead. Not a soul to be found, in a vehicle or otherwise, seemingly for miles in every direction. Now, bear in mind that we didn't know a damn thing about this road, aside from that it was abandoned and poorly maintained. We knew it was abandoned and could be the subject of urban exploration. I pity the poor fools who may have tried their hand at urban exploration in that area before us, or after us. We finally got to the exit that was fenced off with roadblocks that led to the highway. They seemed old themselves. Since I coined the idea, I was condemned to get out and move the roadblocks to open the gate. The moment I stepped out, I felt an insatiable feeling of dread and angst, the kind that a soldier would feel knowing that he was marching into his demise into an unseen danger. I felt like there was something ancient held behind this gate. I felt its presence, and though it didn't seem to be immediately near us, I got the strange sense that I knew it was approaching, entering its domain. I know it sounds juvenile, but it's true. I walked backward back to the truck, ensuring I never took my eyes off the road. When I got back to the car, everyone looked at me with blank faces and distress hidden underneath their facade of calmness. L asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this, as I'm sure he figured out I felt something and perhaps even felt it himself. I said yes in a fake, calm, collected tone and we drove on. We drank a ton. The intensity, it permeated the air beyond that point. A quick reminder not to drink and drive, or you may cause yourself and others some serious problems and nobody wants that. We were just stupid, quote-unquote daring teens back then, but that doesn't justify it at all. Just don't do it. I digress. I don't know where we were going. I think we were just waiting to see some creepy crackhead or ghost car out of the middle of nowhere so that we would have a story to tell. But you have to be careful what you wish for, lest your wishes be granted. And probably you won't want that, even if you think you do. It's hard for me to tell you exactly how long we had been driving for. Being pretty intoxicated made it kind of hard to tell what time it really was, but I do know it was around 10 p.m. The road was set up in such a way that there was a slope separating the two lanes and we were on the lower of the two. Below us, maybe 6 to 8 feet tall, was another slope that just led into miles and miles of dense, unchecked Montana backwoods. I'm not gonna lie. Even while drunk, that forestry below us, especially looking into it, instilled a sense of dread in me. That's when a decently sized rock flew up from the woods at the driver's side window. From the woods abruptly. And let me say that again. From the woods. L abruptly stopped the car and we all instantly sobered up. We looked at each other and we were all pale as sheets. After a long and excruciating silence, M finally said, "Guys, please tell me this is the result of drunken hallucinations. But did you guys just see I cut him off saying, rock come flying out of the woods and hit our car?" M started mumbling something that I couldn't make out, but I could tell he was terrified. Maybe it was other urban explorers or some stupid kids playing pranks. It is Halloween after all, D said. Her voice was shakier than ever. So, what was our brilliant solution to this spooky dilemma? We drank some more and got soused again. Out in the middle of nowhere, we decided probably hundreds of miles from any notable civilizations. At the same time, there was potentially dangerous individuals or animals feet away from us, only separated by a small, albeit steep slope with no service or internet, and we'd also need some time to recover and get sober outside again. So we got out, sat down, and had some food we had packed. We sat there not saying anything, just drinking despite our contrary solution. The last thing I remember that night was that D and M climbed up the slope to the other side of the road to stretch, and we made fun of the two lovebirds for wanting to do it out in the road. I woke up the following day around 5:47 with a hellish hangover, next to my girlfriend G, and A and L passed out in the two front seats of the truck. I woke everyone up groggily. We all unlocked the doors to stretch for a moment to catch our bearings. And then, something caught my eyes. The tires. They were all slashed. I instantly started panicking. "Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap," I said unevenly, trying to think of a way to fix it. Everyone walked over and saw it, and their eyes went wide. I walked over to the run-down railing, looking onto the canopy of forestry and woods, trying to come up with some sort of fact or term to figure out what could have caused this, you know? "Oh crap," I muttered. I heard an echo mock me from the canopy. I overlooked it and didn't pay it much attention. L's reaction was angry. It was his truck after all, and A had a similar response to me, whereas G was throwing up due to what I figured was a mixture of stress and hangover after effects. I walked over to L and told him this was all his fault. "You dumbass, you got us into a world of crap," I yelled. Me? Me? This was your idea from the start. I don't believe that it's my fault that you don't weigh the consequences of stuff like this, you moron. We argued and bantered with many profanities in between each before G interrupted us. Guys, all three of us stopped and looked at her. "Where are D and M?" she exclaimed. She was correct. They weren't with us. We hastily climbed the slope to see at a higher level. They had gone the night before in this direction. There was nothing. There was nobody. I couldn't even tell anyone had been there. We all started yelling their names. We hopped back down to the original level, continuing to call out for them. Then it hit me. I stopped talking and hushed the others. Why was there an echo? It made zero sense. The natural structure of the canopy and wilderness did not correlate with auditory recircling. It seemed to only come from underneath my level, like it was following me. I thought about it for a moment. The slashed tires, they weren't the shape of a knife or a blade or whatever else. They were shaped like 4 sharp fingers had sunken into them. D and M had disappeared without a trace, and there was an odd and illogical echo from the dense forest of which, mind you, we could not see into. Everything put together. The rock that was thrown at us, the dread we felt when opening the gate, hell, even the vacancy of the road. Either there was a once-in-a-lifetime perfect alignment of the stars and this was just insanely inopportune, or there was something inexplicable happening. I accepted it was the latter. Something was wrong. Something was hideously flawed. I could see the cogs clicking into place in everyone else's minds. After a long, intense pause, I said, "Oh, hell," and the echo repeated it. Only I was paying attention now. It was indeed an echo, but it was wrong. It was all wrong. It was garbled and inhumanly deep and monotone. I said, "Oh, hell," to hear it again, "Oh, hell." The echo repeated back in a grotesque mimicry of me. I slowly turned back to my friends. They knew it. This was wrong. This was all wrong. "Oh hell, oh hell, oh hell," I said slowly, backing away from the railing. "Oh hell, oh hell, oh hell." The creature, as I concluded this was indeed a beast, mimicked back. This time, it seemed to move, not stopping, but continuing to repeat "oh hell." It was perverse and a demonic tone. It was moving to my right. I looked over to my right and saw something that could have possibly been the end of me if I had not noticed it. The railing about 20 feet to my right had collapsed, leaving an opportunity to fall, or, what I was more worried about, climb up with relative ease. I screamed at the top of my lungs for everyone to run, and we all booked it the opposite way. I swear I could hear it calmly but loudly echo back in its chillingly otherworldly and malicious mannerism. As it repeated me again, it made it up to our level. As it turned out, our bout of terrible luck seemed to have ended, and as luck would have it, as we ran the other way, we saw a black beater pickup truck slowly approaching us. About 50 feet away from us, this guy was definitely shady as hell, and under any normal circumstances we would have avoided it at all cost. But this was far from normal circumstance. The other three hopped in the truck's bed and I got in the passenger side, where it was plain to see this guy was a meth head. Let me tell you, I've never been so glad to see a meth head in my entire life, and I never thought I would be either. We got out of there. Eventually, when we got back to the safety of, civilization, we called the police and told them everything, crying hysterically and sobbing. Once we finally got back to our parents, we finally felt safe again. Everybody asked us what happened, and we kind of refused to tell them. The guilt was too much. Statements were taken, crime scenes were investigated, and reports were filed. No remains of D or M were ever found, although officially they were classified as deceased. I never saw their parents again. I guess the grief overcame them and they never went out after that. But who knows? There is one thing I do know though. I'll never go back to Highway 87. Hey swamp folks, sorry to interrupt this episode of Spooky Urban Horror Stories. But today's episode is sponsored by our longtime friends at HelloFresh. For those of you new to HelloFresh, HelloFresh gets you farm-fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh's chefs really know how to diversify the menu with seasonal recipes like salmon limon and pasta primavera. Pick your favorites from over 50 different weekly options, and skip weeks when you need to. Change your delivery date or update your preferences all in HelloFresh's convenient app. I've been using this service for over 2 years now, before they even sponsored this channel, and I can tell you it is a lifesaver. With my workout routine and my work schedule, it gets really hard to eat healthy and cook sometimes. But with these pre-portioned meals, it makes it incredibly easy for me to know what to do from day to day in a quick 20 to 30 minute session of cooking. So, what are you waiting for? Join me and tons of others in the swamp. Go to hellofresh.com/swamped16 and use code swamped16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Again, go to hellofresh.com/swamped16 and use code swamped16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. hellofresh.com/swamped16. My name is Riley and I am 26 years old and a guy from Milwaukee. I'm about to tell this story and it is entirely true. It took place about 3 years ago. Here's a bit of background information. It was late summer, probably early September, and a group of my friends and I decided we wanted to go on an urban exploration. We had often done this in some more rundown areas of Milwaukee, usually in the northern side. It was pretty risky because of the area's history of drugs, gang violence, and settlers. However, we were always cautious in these situations and had pretty good luck with never running into crazy people. You could say we were just fascinated by what was inside of the buildings itself, and it gave us a bit of a rush. The night we left, there was a small group of us going, 5 in total. It was my friends, Jamie, Kevin, Vin, and Ty. We all were suburban white kids except for Vin, who was half Asian, and Ty, who was black. We were all relatively the same age, except Ty, who was 29 and had gone to the same high school in the suburb of Bayside where we had lived. My friend Jamie was the only girl going and happened to be the one who would drive us there because she had a large SUV that could fit us all. She also happened to be Kevin's girlfriend at the time. We drive to North Milwaukee, past some terrible neighborhoods and many rundown buildings. The location we were going to was an old elementary school that had shut down back in the late 90s. We had learned about it through an urban explorer group on Facebook and managed to get in contact with a guy who had been there twice. He told me the building was quite large and had 3 floors and a basement floor that was destroyed due to flooding and exposure. He said it still had a stage down there where the little kids would perform in plays and musicals. I remember him telling me that he found some old costumes the kids used to perform in, but he also warned me that there was a lot of black mold and asbestos. Nonetheless, we parked in a large parking lot behind the school that at one point was a busy plaza, but was virtually empty now, and was highly cracked and had weeds growing all across it. We approached the back fence that separated the school playground and the lot. Most of the playground equipment was broken, rusted, or missing. We all walked together to a small opening in the fence by the swing set that would just allow you to get through if you were careful enough. Kevin stood at 6'5" and weighed about 230 pounds, so he knew he couldn't get through. It didn't matter though because we did need one person to wait by the car so it wasn't broken into and to keep an eye out for any cops or any weirdos who came in after us. However, Jamie chickened out due to the weather and wanted to wait with Kevin, so we let her. Ty, Vin, and I got through the fence and made our way across the playground towards the school's back doors. Along the way, I noticed a no trespassing sign a few feet away from the fence, but quickly pushed it out of my mind. There was a chain on the double doors that kept people from entering the school, but it looked like someone had cut it a long time ago, and I kicked it off to the side, where it laid coiled up and rusted. Now, I'm going to talk about the weather that night because it adds a lot to the story. It was in the high 80s, but it felt much higher due to the humidity. In the distance, I remember there were large storm clouds, so I knew we had to hurry with the exploration. Vin had brought a camera with him and Ty was recording with his cell phone and had a flashlight app open. We never ended up not needing the flashlight because obviously it was dark. But there was a little bit of light trickling in so we could see just enough, from the broken ceiling and broken windows. As we entered, the door opened with almost no noise, which was strange. But the floor was covered with pieces of damaged roof, paint chips, trash, and dust. The air smelled very wet and musty. The temperature inside felt much hotter and more humid. But we just wiped our foreheads and held our water bottles in our hands. We looked around the floor, which was the ground floor, for about 15 minutes before we decided to move to the second floor. Ty suggested the basement, but the Facebook guy's description of the staircase condition changed all of our minds. Vin led the way, followed by Ty and me at the rear. The stairs were covered in debris, so our steps made deafening crunches up the staircase. Keep this in mind. We had gone on these explorations many times and have never run into anyone except a very nice homeless woman and her dog many years ago who told us to stay away from heroin. You could say we were overconfident and had our guard down. We reached the second floor, which had more classrooms than the bottom floor. Most of the rooms were trashed entirely due to the weather or vandals coming in. The desk lay all over the bed, either broken or knocked over. Most of the windows were boarded up or broken, and graffiti covered most of every inch of the building that we had seen. However, some rooms were spared and looked as if students who once sat in them had just vanished into thin air, while nature slowly took over the building. Many of the desks still had supplies in them, and the coat hooks still had coats on them. The chalkboard still had things written on it. Ty even found a desk plate with a teacher's name on it that read Mrs. Johnson. After we wiped away the dust, it eventually became clear that people just kind of abandoned this place. I found a folder on one of the desks that belonged to a kid named Kiana. I gathered that she was a girl in 4th grade. It even saw a date on her old assignments that indicated it was from February of 1999. Many of the rooms in better shape had things like this, so we eventually got bored and decided it was time to move on. As we approached the staircase to the 3rd floor, I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. You know, the kind of feeling you get when you think someone is about to jump out and scare you at any minute. I told Ty and Vin about it, and Ty told me not to be a wimp and keep on moving because he was starting to hear thunder in the distance. I noticed that it was starting to get more relaxed in the building, and it was much easier to breathe as we came up to the 3rd floor. It was here where we would run into a strange and frightening situation. I noticed that the school's 3rd floor was different from the other floors. The floor had much more trash on it. The trash appeared to be pretty recent though. Many old pieces of furniture were put in the back part of the first hallway. Then, Ty said something that gave me a good cold chill up my spine. I couldn't tell you why. He noticed that the floor was not nearly as dusty and had fresher footprints than any we had seen earlier. We walked for a few more minutes and I could tell that we were very nervous about running into somebody. Just before we reached a hallway with many classrooms, I decided to text Kevin to see if there was any strange activity outside. He replied within 10 seconds and said that it looked normal, but it could rain at any second. I told him to stay focused and message me if anything odd happened. We looked through many of the old rooms and found nothing but trash, old furniture, and rubble. One of the rooms Vin had walked into had half of its floor caved in. He was lucky that he saw it when he did. A few minutes went by and Ty said, "Dude, check this out." Vin and I walked over to him and saw a bag full of old used syringes. The needles looked very old and the plastic Ziploc bag was torn and tattered. I told him to drop the bag before he got hepatitis or AIDS. We chuckled and continued to walk down the hall toward the furniture pile. We noticed that behind this pile was a staircase wholly filled with old shelves, chairs, and tables. To our right was a large room that was relatively clear but had mattresses scattered about. There were a lot of cigarette butts lying on the floor, and an old rusted oil drum was in the middle of the room. Vin said that the space used to be a library because of a small plaque he had seen above the doorway. It made sense to see why there were so many shelves piled up right outside the door. As we got closer to the far end of the room, we examined the mattresses. There were about 5 of them, and they were all filthy and torn up. Some had disgusting looking stains on them and horrible body odor smells to them. Vin noticed a small stack of pornographic magazines by the bed on the farthest side of the room. We all got a good chuckle out of it. The room had 2 large windows parallel to each other, but they were boarded up and allowed almost no light into the room. As we got to the back of the room, we heard the sound of music being played. All of us froze in unison as the door swung open. There was a man at the entrance of the door. His face told us that he was not happy we were there. He was of average height and had a shaved head and short, scruffy beard. He wore a faded brown shirt and some old white basketball shorts. His shoes were white at some point, but now they were stained brown. He was a white man, but his whole body was covered in a thicker layer of dirt. I'll never forget his eyes. They were very pale blue and looked like the eyes of a wolf. However, I noticed the man behind him, who gave me chills at the same time. This man never once stood up and sat on a lawn chair with his left shoulder pointing towards us. He turned his head and looked at us. The man had bright pink hair, tied in a ponytail, and appeared to have no teeth at all. He looked very skinny, and his skin looked tight and pale. His eyeballs bulged slightly and gave him even more of a frightening appearance. He wore a white t-shirt and black shorts. This man never said a word to us. The man at the door spoke in a very rough and direct voice. He asked us what we were doing in the building, and if we were cops. Ty answered him that we were filming a documentary of the old historical buildings in the area, and we had no intentions of bothering anyone. The man appeared to relax more and asked us how long we wanted to stay. I jumped in and told him that we were almost done and that we were about to head out before the weather got bad. The man lit a cigarette and asked us if we wanted one, but we all declined. He then offered to give us a tour of the building, but we quickly said no. The man's demeanor changed again as a dark and angry look fell on his face, almost as if we offended him by refusing the tour. He eventually chuckled and said okay. He introduced himself as Walter and said the pink-haired man was Ronnie. To our surprise, the man cupped his hands as he hollered out quite loudly for someone named Marty. There was no reply, and the bald man said he must have gone to somewhere else. As we talked for a few more minutes, I took out my cell phone and saw that Kevin sent me several messages. The message said that a man had walked into the building about a minute ago and that we needed to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. The man asked us how many of us there were altogether. I lied and said there were 7 of us because at this point I was feeling very, very uncomfortable. There was just something off about this guy. I was ready to crap myself. The feeling in my stomach was coming back. Something told me that they were very dangerous. Vin and Ty felt the same way and had edgy looks. The radio continued to play, but Walter ordered Marty to turn off the damn radio and that it was giving him a migraine. As he did, 2 things entered my head. He said the pink-haired guy was Ronnie, not Marty, and that as Ronnie or Marty or whoever the heck reached for the radio, I noticed a bungee cord wrapped around his arm and a syringe in it. I don't think Walter saw any of the things I was picking up on, but another man entered the room before anything could happen. This guy was by far the weirdest and most unsettling of the group. He was pretty short and had medium-length, Bieber-style dark hair. His clothes looked so much newer but by far too big for him. He had a blue Milwaukee Brewers t-shirt tucked into his oversized red sweatpants. His face looked sharp and leathery, but he appeared to have a skin condition. His eyes were a beady black color and wide open. Parts of his face were very bright pink and had many bumps on the lower corner of his bottom lip. He spoke in a more high-pitched, rural accent. The other 2 men remained where they had been. Walter is in the doorway, and Marty and Ronnie in their chairs. The new man said his name was George and that he was very interested in Vin's camera. He asked what kind it was, where Vin got it, how much it cost, and why he had it. Vin went on to explain that his hobby was filming videos and that he would often photograph at weddings and other events. This was all true, and the man immediately perked up and smiled. The kind of smile that gives you an uneasy feeling in your gut. The best way to describe it would be how the Grinch smiled in the old animated movie. As creepy as this was, this is when things really started to get bad. He asked Vin if he ever recorded any little girls' beauty pageants or stuff like that. Vin told him no, and the man genuinely looked disappointed. He went on to say some more creepy stuff about how hot the girls were on those pageants, and how he would die to be alone with one of them. Our faces told the story of how we felt about hearing this, but the man seemed oblivious. He asked us all if we had any kids of our own. Ty slipped up and told him that he had 2 twin girls who were 2 years old. The man giggled in a very creepy and cringy way. He then asked Ty if he had ever left the girls alone by themselves or if he had a babysitter. Ty told him that he and his fiancée watched the kids most of the time and would occasionally have his aunt babysit them if they could not. This guy continued to ask creepy questions, like if there were any pictures of the girls. For whatever reason, Ty showed him a few on his phone, and the man asked an odd question. He wondered if he would be allowed to date this guy's daughter. And I'm sure Ty wanted to drop this creep by this point, but he also knew that the other 2 were behind us, so we didn't know if they had guns or knives or what. Instead, he just said that he would have to get to know him more. The man giggled again and said that he would get to know him when he babysat them. The tone of his voice still sends chills down my spine. It was told in such a slow, seductive way that it just left that there was no doubt that this guy was indeed a creep. I saw Ty's brow drop when he was getting pretty upset at this point. I took my phone out and texted Kevin to honk his horn many times. The creepy weirdo stepped toward me and asked me who I was messaging as I did this. He was close enough for me to smell his bourbon breath. I leaned back slightly and told him that we needed to leave soon before bad weather. Walter spoke again and said that we might as well stay since the storm was beginning at any moment, and he didn't want us to get wet. Vin explained that we had 2 friends waiting for us outside. Just as he said that, we could hear a car horn blaring. Both the creep and the bald man showed no reaction to what happened and insisted we stay and invite our friends in. We all stood there and explained that we have to leave, and eventually they agreed. Nonetheless, George insisted he walk us out, and so we walked and got to the ground floor. As we crossed the floor, we could hear his creepy muttering and I don't even know. Every so often he would giggle to himself. We stepped outside. The weather was much more relaxed. The air smelled of ozone, and there was a static feeling in the air as tiny droplets of rain hit my face. George walked us over to the area of the fence we had entered. Ty slipped out first, followed quickly by Vin. They both tumbled down the steep hill and waited for me to go. As I tried to get through the fence, George pushed it against my chest. I was on edge, but it still caught me off guard. I gasped and leaned in close. The smell of bourbon made my head slightly turn. I'll never forget what he said to me in a rapid burst.
I know you know what I am. It doesn't matter, because I like it. You're lucky that that fine girl in that car was with that fat man, or I would have done whatever I wanted to her.
He said whatever. He said it much slower, seductively, and emphasized like he had dreamt about this. He licked his lips slowly at the end of the sentence. His beady eyes widened, and he let go of the fence. I quickly slipped through and tumbled down to the concrete. I was wondering, but I looked up to the creepy psycho. Ty, Vin, Kevin, and Jamie were all there to help me. They all looked at me and looked at this man in shock. Ty hurled an insult at him. George slowly rose up and looked at Ty through the fence. He put his tongue on the chain link border and made a licking motion. He winked, giggled, flashed his grinch smile, and said his last words to us. "For your girls," and gave a clear point to Ty. It took everything we had to keep Ty from going after him, but eventually we lost sight of George, and Ty calmed down. We sat in the car for a while as the adrenaline rush dumped and left us feeling exhausted. We told Kevin and Jamie everything we had seen, heard, and felt. In the car, we decided to make this our last urban exploration ever. We all agreed unanimously that this was too close of a call. As I sat in the car, I kept thinking about each of the men we had seen. Who exactly were they? They were addicts of some kind, sure, but something seemed off about them. The pink-haired man said nothing and was like a ghost. The bald man said little, but his wolf eyes spoke so much, and the creepy man couldn't stop talking. I would later try to find these men on a jail mugshot website. I could never find them until Vin sent me a link to a sex offender registry website a few weeks ago. My heart nearly stopped. Pictured was the guy who said his name was George. He looked much younger and his hair was shorter, but it was undeniably him. He even had the same creepy smile in the photo. However, his real name was Charles Earl Daly. He was a wanted sex offender from Arkansas who was considered a very high-risk offender and possibly armed. His crimes included many assaults on minors under 12 years old, and many other things across that, type of thing, if you know what I mean. I knew how lucky I was to survive an encounter with this guy, and if I only knew who he was at the moment, I probably would have tried to end him. It still sends a shiver down my spine to think that we were in danger. It's hard to say when it all started. My morning routine is pretty mundane, and I kind of just float on through it. Sitting down in my brown recliner that after years of use has conformed perfectly to my body, I would turn on the TV. I don't watch TV, so the channel never needs to be changed. So I just sip my coffee as the news plays in the background. The news acts as background noise, something to disturb the silence as I shuffle through social media on my phone. Occasionally, if a story catches my interest, I'll peek up from my phone and keep a vague eye on the TV. Just last week, I was going through the motion and heard a story about some local businesses that had protesters outside of it. Something about unfair pay. The name of the place was familiar to me, so I momentarily peered at the screen. The camera was focused on the reporter going over the details, and behind him was a crowd of protesters by the street. The news embellished it quite a bit, making the group sound like a pact of people that filled up the block, but it was just a handful of people with hands full of signs. Cars were driving by and honking their horns. That's when one of the males tripped on the curb and the car swept him off his feet. With the camera swiveling to keep the focus on the reporter, I could see the man's body ragdoll in the air until it smacked against the pavement. The people continued chanting their mantra, and the reporter continued speaking on the issue. No one batted an eyelash. Even the car that had struck the man pulled away without bothering to check on the man. I would have just assumed my eyes had deceived me, but every time the camera would spin around just right, I could see his body still in the streets. The camera lingered on the body for just long enough for me to observe his twisted corpse. The fabrics of his red flannel shirt and blue jeans were pulled in unnerving directions by his broken body. The reporter then signed off and gave it back to the newsroom. I thought that surely someone there must have heard or seen the man get hit. There was no way that many people just didn't pay attention to it, or that no other nearby driver stopped. At the time, I convinced myself that perhaps someone was helping the man that was off camera, or the paramedics had indeed been called. I shook it off and went about my day. Although, as I shifted through my clothing, my hands drifted over my flannel shirt. It reminded me of the one the man was wearing, so I pulled it out of the closet, and on the sleeves were several tears in the fabric. It had to be a coincidence. I convinced myself before stuffing it back into the closet and going about my day. I wore dress pants that day. The sun set on that day without incident, and before I knew it, soft golden rays were peeking through my window blinds to wake me. I sat up and once again mindlessly paced through my apartment to get ready for work as my coffee was being prepared. My fingers slipped around the cup's handle and was carried over the chair. There was always an hour for me just to sit and relax before work, so I sat down, pulled my phone out, and turned the TV on. It was then I learned that if a coincidence happens twice, then it really isn't a coincidence. Almost immediately, I was enthralled by the news. Some renegade idiot had thought it would be a fun idea to go on an early morning joyride with someone else's car and some drugs in the back seat. As the car tore down the highway with cops in hot pursuit, I watched through the camera of a pursuing helicopter. I couldn't pull my eyes away as the cars weaved around traffic and plunged through intersections. How more people weren't injured was beyond me, honestly. I was just thankful the traffic was so light that early in the morning. After about 20-some-odd minutes passed, the fleeing car lost traction on a turn and smacked into a nearby light pole, totaling the car. The cops' cars pulled up to the criminal, and then guns were drawn and commands were given. I couldn't help but keep my attention on the man standing in the frame. He was standing on a nearby home's rooftop, looking up at the helicopter. When the camera zoomed in on the scene, unfolding, I got a better look at the guy. He was the spitting image of me, right down to the loose white tee and Pokemon pajamas that I was wearing. The wind ruffled his clothing as his bare feet slid closer and closer to the edge of the two-story roof. I could feel myself lifting from the seat. I wasn't willingly doing it like I was having some out-of-body experience. Before I thought to reach for the remote, he slipped off the top of the house and fell to the ground, landing head-first onto the cement. As he made impact and his neck snapped, it was like it was made of toothpicks. I felt a sharp pain in my head. It was such an intense, hot agony that I dropped from the chair and fell to the floor. Hot coffee slowly enveloped my feet as it spilled from my discarded cup. I couldn't breathe. I could only squirm around on the floor, gasping for air. Then the criminal was detained and the broadcast ended. The pain dissipated from my body, finally able to control myself again. I pressed myself up with my palms. I heaved several heavy breaths. Shortly after managing to compose myself, I called off work. I needed the day to myself. Calling off work turned out to be for the best. My employer called me and informed me that someone had slipped something into the coffee at work, something I had been allergic to. I was told they were looking into it, but they wanted me and a few others to stay home for a while. He was worried it might have been something targeted at me due to the allergy. He didn't offer me much detail beyond that. I was definitely curious. I dwelled on the circumstance of what happened earlier in that morning, and hearing about the incident at work until I couldn't keep myself away. My company was big, and if something like that happened, it would get out to the local news, for sure. So I waited a few hours for the cycle to run its course before any news was introduced and flicked on the TV again. My nerves convinced me to switch on to a channel I don't normally watch, and sure enough, they were covering the incident. My employer must have permitted them to walk inside the offices. It looked like a ghost town. It was eerie to see the place I go to for 8 hours nearly every single day of the week be so empty and silent. The same place that had constant chorus of chattering and ringing phones. The camera panned through the cubicles, and every time it would show a clear shot of the aisles, I could see myself laying on the floor, the foam bubbling from my lips. As the broadcast continued, I could feel my throat start swelling up. Before it went any further, I lifted the remote and turned off the TV. I could see in the dark reflection that a small lump of light, yellow foam, was resting on the corner of my lips. I want to know more. I really do. The rest of the week I decided to stay far away from any sort of live media. Even when I was linked articles from friends, I could see in the preview image for it that I was somewhere on the page. Whether I was behind a group of people taking a photo op or just standing alone in a scenic shot, I never clicked. Everyone wants answers to things they don't understand. I'm no exception to that. But every time I catch a glimpse of my doppelganger somewhere I'm not supposed to be, I could feel a heavy weight in my chest. It was naive to think that I could just ignore the problem. That I could just pull the television plug from the wall and forget all about it. I was supposed to return to work today, so 2 nights ago I decided that I would go out and try to enjoy myself after a very stressful week. I went out to a bar, which is something I don't normally do. I wasn't paying attention as I sipped away, but the bartender had the local news station playing. The drink was getting to me, and my reactions weren't working as they should have, as my eyes pulled to the TV over the bar. I don't think anyone else saw it. No. How could have anyone else seen him, standing in the frame? The report was just a fluff piece to fill the time slot. A report speaking outside of a local sporting event about some sort of nonsense. He, or I, was standing right next to the reporter. I could see the details of the man clearer than I ever could before. Most notably, the smile that folded his cheeks in his searing gaze. We were making eye contact through the screen. I was tipsy, and I wasn't thinking straight. All I felt was an overwhelming fear. I looked down and felt my breath leaving me as I noticed the red flannel shirt I was wearing. Between the small conversations in the bar and the people protesting outside the bar, something about how the business next door was underpaying their employees, there was a crash of anxiety. Looking back at the TV, I saw my copy lifting his arm, and with it came a handgun clutched in his fingers. I lifted from my seat in panic. Everyone in the bar reacted to my sudden movement, and the man next to me attempted to ask if I was okay. It felt like vines were squeezing my heart and my head was becoming fuzzy. Faces in the bar started to blur, and when I looked at the screen, I could see the gun's hammer dropping nearly in slow motion. Panicked and unthinking, I backed away from the bar and turned to exit. The man next to me tried to grab me, something about me being too drunk. I twisted free of his grasp and stumbled out to the door. Not wanting to give my copy enough time to put a bullet in his head, I clumsily stumbled through the door and lost my footing. Passing by a group of people, I finally caught my foot in the street. The car's horn was the last thing I heard before I woke up here, in the hospital. A layer of pain wraps my entire body, sitting just under the numerous casts that has been placed on the broken pieces of me, mainly my arms, which I landed on first. They told me I'd be in here for a while, and gave me my phone to keep myself busy. My phone's battery is dying, and it's late. I called for the nurse a few times, but the hospital remains pretty dark. I'm not worried about the phone, though. I'm not even worried about the pain that is keeping me awake. I'm worried about the neck brace that stops me from turning my head. I'm worried about my inability to reach the TV remote. I'm worried about the goddamn 24-hour news channel they left me with. I used to go to the mountains every year, multiple times if fate would allow it. There's something so peaceful about feeling isolated from the rest of the world. I don't have to look down at my phone and worry about bills or keeping up with my friends. For a brief window of time, it's just me and what the world has created. Every year, I would visit the town of Estes and stay overnight so I could grab an early start and avoid as many people as possible. It had gotten to the point where I was recognized and formed friendships with some of the locals. Most anyone working at the diners, where I got some fuel before heading up the mountain, probably knew who I was. My car and I would traverse the Trail Ridge Road. Stopping on the viewpoints along the road, I would observe the wildlife. Rolling green would lay out in front of me, dotted with the remnants of snowfall. I would make sure to stop at every given opportunity and take a few good breaths to slowly acclimate myself to the higher altitude and lower intake of oxygen. That's what I used to do anyways. I haven't been back there in a few years now. I think it was 3 years ago now that it happened. It's hard to keep track anymore. I try not to think about it too much. I've had issues with the memories popping back up without much cause and sending me into a fit. My chest gets all tight and it's hard to breathe. I swear, whenever it happens, I can hear its footsteps. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My therapist that I started seeing following the event told me it might be a good idea to get it out, write it on paper, or tell people my story. So that's what this is. I have no idea if something like this will help, but at this point I'll try anything. I'd love to finish telling my story and be able to get an uninterrupted night's sleep. So, 3 years ago, like I said, if I ever got the opportunity, I would go back multiple times in a year, and as fate had it, that was such a year. I had a decent chunk of vacation time saved up at work, so I decided to take an extra holiday for myself. Everything went about as you'd expect. It was warmer than normal, as I try to go in the colder months usually. I got into town the same as always. I booked nearly the same room in the same hotel as the last time I visited and threw my stuff into the hotel room. Before heading to bed, I made sure to plot out my intended traveling so I could show someone where I was planning to go. I had been there so many times, and as beautiful as everything was, I liked to try and go off the beaten path when I could. In the event something happened to me, I wanted people to know where I was. That's exactly what I did the next morning. I was greeted by the workers at the local diner and made sure to show them the map, telling them when I expected to return. With enough fuel to get me through most of the day, I headed out. The first place I wanted to go was a decent drive up Trail Ridge Road, Lulu City, a place I was surprised that I'd never gotten around to visiting. Pulling onto the side of the road, I sat at the shoulder looking at the elevation between me and the town. A town that had diminished into a small portion of the horizon. Turning the car off and locking it, I was pleasantly surprised to find myself alone on the trail. The fewer people that were around me, the more connected to the environment I could feel. It's like when you watch a movie in the theater. You're so much more immersed when it's quiet. Just a few chattering conversations can taint the entire experience. They say with hindsight, it's much easier to see the red flags. When I think back though, it's hard for me to tell where my first sign to turn back really was. You'll hear a lot of sounds walking through the forest, and sounds travel pretty far. So it's hard to say what's unusual and what isn't. Even if you've heard something hundreds of times, it can sound alien. I remember as I was walking the trail, I heard what sounded like several booms from a distant thunder. The noise happened in rapid succession, like the beating of drums, though the weather hadn't called for such noises. At the time, I thought it could have just been the snapping of a nearby tree and the resulting noise of it was smacking into the ground. I ignored it and continued on my path, feeling the mountain air fill my lungs surrounded by trees, all by myself. There was the occasional skittering of wildlife. I even came across a large print in the middle of the trail. I assumed it to be a bear, as black bears have been spotted near the trail. It's a nearly 4-mile hike, which isn't all that bad as the elevation didn't climb too much. Around 2 hours after I had initially set out, I found myself looking at the old sign for Lulu City, an old mining town that had been abandoned in the 1800s. I walked slowly through the place. There were old cabins around the area and various plots of land that once served as foundations for more homes. It was incredible to sit in a ghost town, nestled near the Rocky Mountains. It was almost as if the place had pushed them out. From the little research I had done, it seemed like the profit margin for the silver they were mining just wasn't enough to justify the town. Though, knowing what I know now, I can't help but wonder if something else was at play all those years ago. I looked around for a while at the large open area where the town used to sit. There were around 40 cabins at the town's prime. All that remained were the remnants of 3, a few building sites, and a sign for the town. Citing the population was at 200 people. I sat down for a moment, leaning my back against the tree, looking at the area surrounding me, pouring some water down my throat. I watched the tree line. There was this creeping sensation you get when someone is staring at the back of your head. I felt that, but it was like I knew where the feeling was coming from, but I couldn't quite see it. As I was focused on an area of trees where the paranoia was stemming from, I noticed a shadow moving. I had thought at first it was just a dark area where the sun had difficulty getting through. As this shadow shifted, however, it was revealed there was just a dark mass blocking my view. My initial reaction was to just assume the figure was a black bear or an elk, but it was hard to convince myself of that, as the shadow reached far too high off the ground. Either way, I just sat and watched. I wasn't about to call any attention to myself, especially if my initial reaction was correct. I had bear mace and the likes, but if I could avoid using it, I would rather do that. With the shadow retreating into the woods, I stood slowly from my spot and decided to exit Lulu. As I turned around, I heard a familiar cracking of trees. This time, however, the sound continued for a good minute or two. It was as if the drums of war had been rung and a warning was shooting through the mountain. I wondered if anyone on the other trails were able to hear the noise, as it was so loud that it made me cover my own ears. As I started retreating from the noise, it stopped, and as I reached the exit to Lulu City, I saw a shadow once more. This time it was much closer to me. I was able to make out more about it. Part of its dark structure being the antlers atop its head. They weren't the same, jagged and pointy antlers that decorated the indigenous elk around Rocky Mountain. They were more solid, resembling that of a moose's. They were much larger than any pair I'd seen before, though. Large enough to shovel the snow out of the driveway in one go. I backed up a bit, hearing the foliage bending and cracking under my footsteps. I honestly did not know how to approach the situation, because I did not know what I was looking at. The thing was still shaded by the trees, and I couldn't make out its body structure other than it being massive. I wonder how something of that size was able to move so quickly through the trees. Then I caught a glimpse of the eyes it was using to watch me. It was only when shreds of light reflected off of them. The first 2 shimmering orbs appeared from under its antlers, and then to my shock, another set of lights, fainter than the ones above them, appeared. It was uncanny. Looking at something with such a familiar shape, yet I couldn't decipher what the thing was, or what it wanted from me. I didn't want to keep staring, in case it took direct eye contact as a threat. Averting my gaze, I listened to the creature stumbling around before the commotion caused by their movements dissipated into the foreground. With the noise of that thing distant, I turned back and saw no sight of the thing. I decided it was best to leave the area quickly and quietly. I thought the thing might consider Lulu City its territory and was giving me a stern warning. I started walking back, ready for the easy hike. Watching the dirt path at my feet, I came across a fresh footprint. It was massive. Putting my foot into it revealed that my foot didn't even make up half the size of one of its toes. The thing was massive and heavy. I didn't want to call my trip short, so as I walked the trail back to my car, I thought of just going to the next spot ahead of schedule. I always try to end my visits by looking out over Bear Lake. It's just so pristine, it's hard to ignore. I kept my eyes on the trees the whole time, making sure that some hulking shadow wasn't lurking. Before I knew it, I was exiting the trail and climbing into my car. With a hum, and the vehicle sprang back to life. It wasn't too long before I had gotten to as far as my car would take me before I had to stop and walk the rest of the way. Surprisingly, once again I found myself alone. There were a few other cars where I parked, but once I got to the lake, I didn't see anyone else on the trails. It felt like everyone had been scared off. Bear Lake is normally a pretty popular spot for people visiting. I had the feeling like I was missing something, like everyone else got a memo that I didn't. I sat for a while on a large boulder by the side of the lake, watching the winds ripple small patterns over the smooth surface of the water. It wasn't often you could go there and not hear the howling of screaming children and their parents, so I intended to soak as much of it in as I could. As I sat there, I could see the line of trees on the other side of the lake. The tops of them created an ocean of green that only surrendered to the peaks behind them. I watched that ocean of green sway like a hurricane was sweeping through them. The treetops moved and buckled as I heard familiar smacking noises begin to get louder. The realization dawning on me that whatever I had seen before wasn't warning me. It had been following me and continued to do so as I left the site. I had driven there though. I thought it would be impossible for that thing to be able to have made it here so quickly. With the shifting of the treetops getting closer, I slowly rose to my feet when I saw something eject from the top of the trees. It hung in the air for a moment before crashing down into the lake before me. It was brief, but I saw the object enough to know that the thing had flung a rock rather large, probably bigger than my body, like it was nothing. I started stepping backward when my ankle rolled on a rock and I fell backward, crashing to the ground. My elbow made contact with the hard surface, pulling apart the fabric of my sweater and slicing through my skin. Quickly, I opened the small first aid kit I had brought with me, hearing the thunderous noise getting closer. I poured my drinking water onto the wound and wrapped it with a bandage. As I finished tending to the small wound, I noticed that the noise had halted. Slowly ignoring the pain in my ankle and the stinging on my elbow, I looked over the rock to see. The trees were no longer swaying, only moving with a gentle push of the wind. That's when I heard a noise to my right. A huff. Turning slowly, avoiding sudden movements, I saw the beast that had been watching me. I saw it bathed in the sun, every detail. This thing was some twisted amalgamation. It dwarfed me in size. I could have been twice as tall and still not met it eye to eye. I did not know what I was supposed to do, if I was supposed to run or stay still. I watched its pitch black fur ruffle as it took a step towards me, offering another huff out of the bear-shaped nose. Its whole head reminded me of a bear, except for the angular structure around its eyes that looked more like a buck. 4 stern and focused eyes, all of varying shades of amber, peered toward me. Its body, again, was reminiscent of a bear that had a bizarre length to it, almost like its belly was dragging against the dirt. If it wasn't for the massive paws pushing down into the ground, the thing would topple over. It moved its head back and forth, shaking its whole body. Small clicking groans emitted from the open jaw, a jawline with thick and sharp teeth. My reasoning was starting to go out the window, and the urge to just run and get the heck out of there was mounting by the moment. I was backing away and had noticed I was making it back to the trail, but the creature matched my movements. We were both surrounded by trees, and the thing started moving its head side to side, smacking its large antlers onto the nearby trees. As it did, the tree's bark ripped free, exposing lighter tones. As close as I was, the smashing of the massive antlers against the trees was like a shotgun going off next to your ear. It caused me to hold my hands over my ears as I tried to back away. I wanted to run, but the moment I put too much pressure on my ankle, I knew I would buckle, so all I could do was continue to back away, hopping, and just hope that it wouldn't charge. It just kept walking forward, smacking one tree after another like it was trying to intimidate me. I watched amazed as if its large frame bulldozed through the trees like it was nothing. I don't know what I did to upset it more than I already had, but the clicking noise from its mouth picked up and it charged at me. The ground was trembling under the thing's footsteps, and before I had time to process what was happening, an antler made contact with me. The memories get all foggy from there. I remember being shunted to the side, my legs colliding with a tree, and I spun out into the bush. Nearly unconscious, I laid surrounded by dirt and leaves as the bear-like creature approached me. It smelled me, interested particularly in the blood spilling out of my legs where the bones had broken on impact. I got a good look at its eyes before I passed out. One was a set of eyes that you'd expect to see on a mammal, while the others were more lizard-like. Those eyes were the last thing I saw before passing out. It was a miracle I ever made it out of there. Some other visitors had heard the commotion and headed over to find me passed out. They stopped my bleeding and got me to the hospital in Estes. I wish I could go hiking still. I'm not afraid of running into that thing again, but my legs were beyond repair, and I haven't been able to walk ever since. I still think about that creature. I did as much research as I could, but never found anything that looked like that thing. Some monstrous combination of a bear and elk. I wondered if that was the real reason Lulu City was abandoned. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't think I'll ever know. Sometimes I hear the clicking noises it made. Every thunderstorm I hear makes me think about the creature bashing its head into the trees. Maybe it did that as a show of strength, like when bucks smack their antlers together. I don't want to believe that's true though, because I couldn't imagine what a behemoth like that needs to prove its strength to. What other secrets could the Rocky Mountains contain? Are there more of those things there? Or perhaps another manner of beast? Every night I go to sleep, I look out my window. I think of those 4 eyes peering at me through the dark, waiting to finish what they started. I'm not sure if I'll ever feel better having written this all out. Reading it as I go, I almost don't believe it myself. Maybe I'll feel better if I just convince myself nothing ever happened. That I just fell and tumbled hard enough to crack the bones in my legs like twigs. Maybe then, I'll be able to get some sleep. Thanks for listening to these creepy and downright disturbing horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this episode gets, the more YouTube promotes it, and that helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new episode, as I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you're listening to this over on Apple Podcast or Spotify, be sure to give this a 5-star rating over there, as it helps me out a ton. If you're on the go, but don't have YouTube Premium, but would like to download and listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories no matter where you are, you can download them absolutely free from Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and anywhere else you get your favorite podcast online. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that truly help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you'd like to support the swamp outside of YouTube, maybe come join me on Twitch. I stream multiple times a week where we play horror games, watch horror movies, and do all kinds of cool stuff together as a community. Be sure to join me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.